welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 128, John Hall of Stratford-Upon-Avon, a conversation with John Taplin. The world of Stratford-Upon-Avon that we see as revolving around the early Shakespeare has been studied in a lot of detail, thanks to those Shakespeare connections. One approach to understanding the society that Shakespeare grew up in, that provided his education and informed his life choices, is to look at the families who lived in, worked in and ran the town of Stratford-Upon-Avon. My guest today is John Taplin, who has done just that in his 2-volume book 21st Century Shakespeare Gleanings, where he documents the life of some of the significant Stratford families who moved in Shakespeare's orbit, or perhaps I should say, in whose orbit Shakespeare moved. When I spoke to John, we concentrated on his latest investigations into the ancestry of John Hall, Shakespeare's son-in-law, where he only very recently uncovered some new information. But of course, in his books there is a lot more detail on all of his subjects that we couldn't hope to cover in a short conversation. John Taplin spent the majority of his career in management in the telecommunications industry until 2001, when he joined the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust at Hall's Croft, Nash's House and New Place, in Stratford-Upon-Avon, until retiring in 2010. A historian, genealogist and biographer, he has published articles on Shakespeare, his contemporaries and associates in and around Stratford, including the families directly associated with New Place, Shakespeare's Stratford home, before and after Shakespeare's lifetime. In 2011, he published his book Shakespeare's Country Families, a documentary guide to Shakespeare's country society. He was a member of the advisory board for the Trust's Dig for Shakespeare project at New Place between 2010 and 2015, and in 2018 he published a revised and updated edition of his 2011 book. He has a master's degree in historical studies from the University of Leicester in the UK. I spoke to John from his home over Zoom. I know that you've done lots of research into some of the Stratford families that we hear about as being connected to Shakespeare in some way. Before we talk about some of the detail there, can you just give us an idea of the documents that are available for this type of research and how difficult or otherwise they are to interpret?
Yeah, sure. Talking specifically about the Shakespeare family and their relatives and friends and contemporaries at the time, in and around Stratford, then the research is largely based, although not exclusively, on local sources and records. My personal approach to investigating particular individuals and families is to use these sources to develop, first of all, a genealogy of the family, using parish records where they're available, documentary sources in local and national archives, such as those held at County Records Office, for example, National Archive, and of course the rich resources that are held here in Stratford by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Personal records generated either by primary sources such as letters, wills, or mentioning similar documents by others who knew these people and had dealings with them are invaluable in expanding the information for each family. So that's my general background starting in terms of a research program into a particular family. I find there's many cross-references between these resources. So as one gets familiar with them, then you're able to actually make links between the different families. I also find that popular histories and biographies, which is probably the way most casual readers are wishing to find out something about the Shakespeare family, find their information. And whilst these are adequate for such purposes, they're not really what I can find useful for this type of in-depth research that I find is necessary. There's also, of course, many other resources, particularly those found by examining local history organisations, and these can provide valuable information which has been extracted with much effort, I must say, which would be very difficult to find for individual researchers like myself. About these. And there's a recently published Wills Stratford-Upon-Avon Wills between 1348 and 1701, which was edited by Stephanie Appleton and Mary MacDonald. These are of immense value in providing very personal insights into the wide cross-section of Stratford residents contemporary to Shakespeare and his family. Another resource that has been recently completed was the publication of the seventh and final volume, edited by Dr. Robert Bierman, of the minutes and accounts of the Stratford Corporation. This is a huge resource which has taken the best part of a century to put together and provides intimate information of the town council's minutes and the individuals who are involved in town governance over that sort of period, which encompasses the life of Shakespeare's father and indeed himself. Another resource which is recent in that sense is the 2021 book, The Private Life of William Shakespeare by Lena Cohen Orland, which has used much of these resources to provide a fresh approach to the poet's life and the influence of the town and some of its inhabitants in shaping his choice of career. In terms of how difficult or challenging it is to use the resources, it does take a degree of skill. You pretty much need to be able to read Secretary Hand to transcribe wills and documents. But it's a very rewarding effort as well. And it provides the background to Shakespeare within what I've termed his country society that helps a better understanding of his life outside of his London career.
Yeah, from what I've seen, the little I've seen, incredibly difficult to read and interpret that hand, particularly from wills, and to understand the degree that some things might be a mistake or otherwise. Even in Shakespeare's will, we have evidence that there was probably mistakes and corrections going on. So presumably that happens throughout the documentation that you're looking at.
Well, a lot of the wills that are available for free these days on the National Archives site. So that's a boom that really came about because of COVID. At one time, we used to have to pay £3.50 for a copy of each will, and because of COVID, they removed that requirement, and so that's been a boon as well. But in terms of Shakespeare's will, of course, that was produced in a rather rough fashion. We don't have a clean final copy, as it were. It's the one with all the interlineations and so on. So that itself is rather unusual for wills that were actually proved at the Branch Court of Canterbury, at least with Harry. That's something.
Yes, quite. Very important document for all of us interested in this. So let's talk about some specifics. I know that John Hall, the husband of Shakespeare's daughter, has been a particular area of study for you recently. And he is an interesting case for several reasons. So could you outline, maybe we'll start with some of his ancestry as far as we know it, and then talk about him and Susanna.
Yeah, well, of course, John Hall is of particular interest to perhaps two groups of scholars in a sense, because from the point of view of the fact that he was probably the man for the last decade of Shakespeare's life, who knew him perhaps better than anyone else, certainly within Stratford, sort of ignoring those that knew him in London for a moment. But the other area, of course, is those medical historians who are interested in him as an early 17th century doctor, and particularly, of course, because many of his cases were published later in the 17th century.
Oh, right.
So from that point of view, he's of dual interest. But his ancestry is the area that perhaps I was more particularly interested in, having spent my first few years with the Birthplace Trust, actually working at Croft for a while. It was really something that many writers strove over numerous years to try and untangle, just who was this John Hall in any case. And with a name like that, of course, it was bound to lead to some alternative candidates as to who it might be.
Just because it was a common name?
Because the name is quite common. And of course, various people who investigated Hall's background in the early days came up with different ideas. There were suggestions that he was from a family of Halls from Worcester. Someone else thought he was from a little village near Stratford called Illicut. And then others thought he was from Oxfordshire, from either Banbury or Swerford in Oxfordshire. And then actually quite early on, in the sense, back in the 19th century, it was suggested that he might actually be connected to a man called William Hall from Acton in Middlesex, although he had originally believed to be living in Carlton, a little village in Bedfordshire. And for quite a long time in the early part of the 20th century, his identity sort of went backwards and forwards, who various people became favourites for a while and then fell out of favour. In fact, in 1930, Edgar Fripp stated with absolute certainty that he was the man who matriculated at Balliol College in Oxford on the 4th of February 1592 as the son of a gentleman from Worcester. But quite shortly after that, there was a publication made by a man called Frank Marshall, a book called William Shakespeare and His Daughter Susanna in 1931, which actually brought most Shakespeare biographers to come to agree that he was probably the son of this William Hall of Acton, Middlesex, and formerly from this village, Carlton in Bedfordshire, whose will was written shortly before his death in December 1607. Marshall published a transcript of Hall's will in his book and mentioned in it of two sons, Di, usual name, spelled either D-I-V-E or D-Y-V-E, and John, allowed the association of these to be two young men who matriculated from Queen's College, Cambridge, with the Cambridge alumni showing that they entered the university together in Michaelmas 1598, being described as of Bedfordshire. So that was what sort of settled pretty much up to the present day, really. The fact that people, come down very much so on the side of John Hall being from the village of Carlton originally, the son of William Hall. But although this has become generally accepted as being fact, in fact, there is no actual definitive documentation or documentary evidence to prove that William Hall was John's father and John, the son-in-law of William Shakespeare, eventually. So this was a particular interest of mine at the time, because I thought, well, can we actually delve further into this and find out if this is true? And the baptisms and burials at Carlton, in the registers of Carlton, show that a William Hall had at least 7 children born there, although there are no sons called Di or John, and also 2 daughters who we find mentioned in Hall's will, Elizabeth and Frances, also don't appear in the parish records there. But if we add those to the children that we do find baptized, then it would suggest that William Hall had at least 11 children who were born in Carlton. The entries for the missing children are very likely because there is a bit of a hiatus in the Carlton records around the time they would have been born. The presumed birth year of John, which is 1575, but it's probably fairly accurate, he was born around that time. So whilst there was no definitive evidence at that time, I then thought, well, probably the best place where we might find something about this would be to go and examine the archives of Bedfordshire. So I actually visited the Bedford archives, and there I found what proved to be the first clue to some of the earlier ancestry of John Hall. I found a document dated 1609 in which a John Hall appears in a conveyance of land by Di Hall to a man called Thomas Barringer, of a village called Stevington in Bedfordshire, for quite a substantial amount of money, actually, £76, 13 shillings and 4pence. And this document confirms that this property, in the words of the document, was sometimes the inheritance of William Hall Gent, deceased, late father of the said Di. So that was the first bit of evidence that gave us a clue. The document also added that the said John Hall was the deceased great-grandfather of the said Di. So now we were starting to get a little bit of a family tree here. And later research in the same archives uncovered an indenture document for a covenant of a levy of a fine at the same village of Stevington in 1570, in which William Hall Carlton Gent, the son of Christopher Hall, late of Edgeworth in the county of Middlesex, gentleman deceased, transfers to Edward Wilkinson of Stevington a property called Aylofts in that village, as well as other property and land in the nearby villages of Bromham and Stiggs. All late of John Hall deceased, grandfather unto the said William of Stevington. So now we've gone back another generation. So this Christopher, who is of Edgeworth in Middlesex, is said to be the father of William. So we've basically now got a family tree that takes us back to John Hall, Christopher Hall, William Hall, and then to the two sons, Clive and John. So this is quite a substantial addition to our knowledge. But further to that, the document also tells us that Williams Hall's now wife was called Julian. In fact, obviously we didn't know before. So this tells us that this Julian was probably the mother of Clive and John, and almost certainly all the other children. So this has now established quite firmly that the family were from this small area of Bedfordshire. Further research, this time from the London Metropolitan Archives, traced the will of Christopher Hall himself, who was from a place called Little Stanmore in Middlesex. All these places were actually very close to modern-day Edgeworth in Middlesex. He published his will in January 1546, and the will, which was probably produced quite hurriedly from his oral wishes, mentioned that his wife was called Alice, and that he wished to be buried at the local church, St. Lawrence. And he asked for his debts to be paid, and to accomplish this, that Alice sells a house in Bedford, in the county of Bedford, and the will names no children or other possible relatives other than Isabel Hall, a widow, who witnessed the will. So whilst there's no reference of any children, particularly a William, of course, this seems to fit in with the general family tree that found in Bedfordshire. And I suggest that there is no mention of William because probably Christopher died whilst his wife was actually pregnant with the young William. So that's the family tree as far as I've traced it. And obviously we know more then later on about John and Dive because of their university alumni entrances.
So what I find interesting there is even though we think of this as a period of history where, generally speaking, people didn't move around much from wherever they were born, we've got a family here that was Bedfordshire based, but then end up in Acton, and at least one of them ends up in Stratford-Upon-Avon. Do we know how John came to Stratford?
No, it's one of the questions I think is still outstanding. There are a number of possible clues. There was a John Hall who was a doctor who was involved in of all things, a witchcraft case around 1605. And it's quite possible that he could be the John Hall who eventually came to Stratford. And it has been suggested that because of Shakespeare's own association with Oxford, we believe he stayed over in Oxford on occasions, that possibly he may have met Hall there. But it's all speculation. We really have no idea.
Yeah.
In fact, we don't know exactly when Hall came to Stratford. We know, obviously, that he married Susanna in 1607, but we don't know when he arrived. It's often said that he came to Stratford around 1600, but as I'll mention a bit later on, I found something quite recently, actually, that shows that he was still in Acton in 1600.
One thing we do know about the Halls is that they do seem to be a bit of a family who couldn't quite get on with each other, and quite typically for the time they took to the law when they thought redress was necessary. So can you just outline what you've found out about the legal disagreements between them? And this is concerning the house in Acton.
Well, William Hall died in 1607. He made a will in December, early December that year. And it's an interesting document. It's one in which he expresses a degree of frustration with both of his sons, but particularly with the eldest one, died, and also shows some doubt that his younger son, who is often considered to be his favourite, that John would actually act as he requested, as his executor. William in his will says if John won't do it, then he nominates Di, and if he won't do it, then he nominates a man called Michael Wells. Now, Michael Wells, his son-in-law, had married one of Hall's daughters, Frances. And Wells himself was the son of the rector of Carlton, a man called Thomas Wells, who reputedly lived to be over 100. And Michael Wells and Frances lived in a place called Glatton, I think it's called. It's in Hertfordshire. As it transpired, when William died, John actually did obtain probate on the will of his father. It was actually settled on Christmas Eve that year. But almost immediately he came to an agreement with his elder brother to transfer the executorship of his father's will, including the stewardship of the inheritance John had received of his father's house and property in Everton, together with the obligations to settle his father's debts and legacies. And this was largely because of John being remote from Everton and also his obligations as a physician in Stratford. And this arrangement seems to have worked well for both brothers. We have evidence of Di actually dealing with some legal matters around 1613 on John's behalf, and also worked in Di's benefit because he had the benefit of his father's old house and, of course, looking after the remainder of the inheritance for John in his absence. However, in 1626, Di passed away, and Michael Wells, the brother-in-law, claimed that he'd made an oral or recopitive will, leaving all his property, as he states, goods, chattels, lands, tenements, hereditaments, whatsoever, unto his brother-in-law, Michael Wells, and makes absolutely no reference at all to his brother John. Now, Wells managed to get this oral will approved at the PCC, and later he was also to state that Di had produced a written will 4 days after the oral one, which confirmed the wishes expressed in the non-cooperative will. Now, once this will was proved by the Court of Canterbury, Michael Wells apparently didn't actually gain control of the estate. Now, we don't quite have any documentary evidence of what John did, but he obviously tackled the situation at the time, and there's no evidence that Michael Wells actually got any of the property. In fact, he seems to have rented much of it from John Hall. It wasn't until 3 years after Di's death that Michael Wells and his wife, Frances, actually brought a case against John Hall in 1629 to try and reassert the claim to the estate. John, again, of course, tackled this within the court, and he obviously retained the property at Acton, because when he himself died and wrote his will, he actually left the estate to his daughter Elizabeth. So this was quite clearly in John's mind an attempt by his brother-in-law to fraudulently deceive or deprive him of the estate that he had inherited from his father. So this was obviously quite a family argument, I would imagine, that known the absolute details. So they did go to court about that.
Yes, there's some things the record won't tell us, I guess, about the nature of people's interpersonal relationships and why they might have fallen out with each other. All we see is some of the results of it, and it's all a bit opaque still.
Yes, it's still a bit of a mystery why Wells was particularly interested in the property at Acton, other than obviously its financial value, because he didn't live there. But he seems to have had a bit of a record of, I'd say, a troublemaker, who can say, because we know that he was involved in a case in his own town against a local property owner who he was renting property from. So he brought a case against him as well, claiming that there was some chicanery going on in in the purchase of the estate that he lived on.
Mm.
So he got a bit of a record, I think, in the background.
So we end up with John, who becomes apparently a very busy doctor in Stratford, obviously meets Susanna either because he already knows her father, or maybe they just meet in Stratford, who knows? And they get married on a date we have very specifically. We don't really have anything more about their life after that, pretty much until Susanna's death, I think.
Well, obviously, we know they had a daughter. The daughter was born probably within 9 months of the marriage. She either got pregnant immediately, or her daughter Elizabeth was born slightly prematurely. She was baptised in Stratford in February 1608. I think it's unusual in the fact that Susanna is not mentioned at all in William Hall's will. So you'll remember I said that William died in December 1607. So his son had been married for some 6 months by that time, and his new daughter-in-law was obviously carrying his grandchild, but he doesn't mention her at all in his will. And I think this is unusual because he mentions pretty much everybody else who was related to, including his daughters and their children, but he seems to specifically ignore Susanna. Now, one has to wonder why. Surely he would have been anticipating the birth of a new grandchild. Was he not involved in the marriage settlement? If there was one, but we don't know. But what we do know about William is that he was very much a strict Protestant, and probably what we might today call a Puritan. And one has to wonder whether he would have looked on with much pleasure the thought of his favourite son marrying Claire's daughter. It's funny enough that it's an aspect that I haven't found anyone comment on anywhere else. It seems rather unusual in many senses, because most minutiae of Shakespeare's life has been examined in great detail. But I think there is something in the fact that Paul probably didn't want to be associated with the Shakespeares at all, which is why I didn't mention it.
And you mentioned that John Hall went on to publish his own works as a doctor. Is there an ending to his story?
Well, Hall didn't actually publish them.
By someone else after his death.
Yes, they were published by a doctor who actually came to Stratford with the parliamentary troops around 1642, after the Civil War started. Stratford was one of those towns that seemed, it never really was garrisoned, but it changed hands in terms of influence between the Cavaliers and the King's side and the parliamentary side on a number of occasions. And on this particular occasion, the doctor came to Stratford, who was with the parliamentary troops, engaged with Susanna, and apparently she either gave, sold, or whatever, copies of Hall's cases. And they were published, I think, 3 times in the 17th century. But there's no mention of Shakespeare.
I must say, one thing that struck me when I was looking at your books is that you draw the picture of these interrelated families who live and work around Stratford, but they all mostly have interests outside of Stratford as well, particularly heading towards London and Oxford. People often think of Stratford as an out-of-the-way place that Shakespeare couldn't wait to get away from because he wanted to work in the theatre. Now, yes, to work in the theatre, he absolutely had to be in London to be successful. But Stratford wasn't an isolated place, it seems to me. It was actually quite a busy market town with many connections to other parts of the country, and was populated by people who had arrived from other places as well. Maybe a good deal more cosmopolitan than we might think of it.
Yes, I think there's been a trend in certain quarters to denigrate the town as a bit of a Picksville, impossible for anybody to come from with any talent and so on. But Stratford was no different from the vast majority of towns of a similar size, 2,000 to 3,000 people in the era. In fact, everything about the town is very similar to other towns of its size and even larger. The formation of its corporation, the nature of the people, very often shared interests, as you say, both in business in the town and as yeoman farmers, I suppose we would call them. They had an interest in the land which they'd retained. Many of them had actually moved to the town, or at least from families that were based as farming families outside the town. Sons would move into the town to become apprenticed and so on, take up trades. And there was very much a hierarchy of this type of people in the town. In fact, they formed something of an oligarchy in terms of the corporation in the second half of the 16th century. But there's nothing unusual about that. It's mirrored in other towns, in Warwick, in Worcester, very, very similar, particularly with the growth of Protestantism. As the Protestant religion became the national religion again under Elizabeth, that firmed up a position in society. And also, if you look at the school, Stratford School has produced, or at that time, produced far and away more graduates that went on to university than would be expected of such a small school. Probably never had more than a few score children in it at any one time. Would have only had a head teacher and possibly an usher to help him. But they produced quality students who went on to university, mainly at Oxford, of course, is the nearest university. So it has been misrepresented, I think.
What do you see as the remaining outstanding questions about the Hall family? Is there more that you think you and other researchers would be able to find out in time?
Well, certainly there's more to be found. Simply as we said now, one of the questions is, well, what attracted John Hall to Stratford? Why did he come and when? We still don't know that. One sort of interesting development was the will I found of a man called Thomas Waterhouse. It's dated in August 1600. He was from Whitchurch in Buckinghamshire. But this will reveals that both William Hall and his son John were still resident at Acton in Middlesex at the time of the will. So this business of when did John come to Stratford, often quoted as around 1600. This still places John in Acton with his father in 1600. We think that William Hall moved from Bedfordshire probably around about 1598, maybe 1599 at the latest. We don't know when his wife died. She wasn't recorded in the burials at Carlton, and she's not recorded in the burials at Acton either. But she's definitely deceased by the time he wrote his will. So we don't know what happened to her. But this man, Thomas Waterhouse, was actually treated by John Hall. And in the will, he actually states that he will pay in future £8 to Hall for his medication. And further than that, he names William Hall and a man called Baldwin Shepherd as overseers to his will. Now, Baldwin Shepherd was the brother of William Shepherd, who became doctor and was also the husband of one of William Hall's daughters, Sarah. So there's a connection there. It seems that Waterhouse actually resided at Acton with the Halls, perhaps maybe because of his final illness, who knows, but that he was buried at Acton on the 4th of August, 1600. And whilst I'm mentioning the name of Waterhouse, it's an interesting coincidence. It is a coincidence that we had a small book in Stratford about a year ago now that was on exhibition at Nash's house of tiny writing, I think called micrographic writing, of notes that were made by what was called on the TV program the first Shakespeare geek. And this
First
has
of many.
at the back of it This has at the back of it a copy of the Waterhouse family arms. So that's quite an interesting little thing. I've actually done more research into that, which I know quite a bit more about. But that's one area. I mean, why did he come to Stratford? When did he come?
Plenty to keep you busy there.
There's plenty more. There's plenty of other things. So, I mean, for example, we don't know if there was ever a marriage contract between Susanna and for John Hall and Susanna's wedding, which we know that Shakespeare was quite particular in ensuring that his second daughter, Judith, was protected financially when she married Thomas Quiney. So one would have expected a similar situation to involve his elder daughter. But we've never found such a contract or any indication of a marriage to the Halls and the Shakespeares. And also, another aspect that would be very interesting to find out is, where did John Hall spend his so-called missing years after he graduated from Cambridge? He received his master's in 1597. It's traditionally thought that he travelled abroad, possibly to study medicine in a continental university, but no actual evidence has ever been found. There's another area. Who was John Hall's mother? We only know now of her first name. We don't know her family name prior to her marriage. I suggested at one point that she might have been from this family called Dive, which was a prominent family in Bedfordshire, but I can find no connection with the family. So, and perhaps finally, going back to William's will, he mentions two sisters. Now, if you remember, in his father's non-coveted will, Christopher's will, there's no mention of William himself, and I assumed that he was born posthumously. But in the will, William mentions he's got two sisters, one called Carter, one called Knight, surnames. We don't know if they were married or precisely why they've got those surnames. But I suggest that they're half-sisters and that his mother, Alice, must have remarried at least once after Christopher's death. And so we don't know who these women are. Again, in his will, Paul mentions children of his daughters, and we don't know very much more about them. So there's a lot of areas that are open to further study.
And as you've already described to us, just finding the smallest piece of information can open up a whole new arm of understanding.
Precisely. Just as an aside, a sister of this man, Thomas Waterhouse, Catherine, she married when she was well into her dotage, as it were, a man called Daniel Baker, who was one of the aldermen of Stratford. And she moved to Stratford. So there's another link there. But these are little sort of tidbits of information that you sort of glean as you go along through all of these wills and documents and so on. And it becomes quite fascinating.
My thanks to John for taking his time to talk to me and helping all of us to get a more vivid sense of the society that Shakespeare would have known. If you'd like to follow up on the details we discussed and much more, John's book, 21st Century Shakespeare Gleanings, is available in a single volume ebook edition. I've put links to that in the show notes and on the website. Next time, it's back to the plays as we continue with the third part of Henry VI, as the English nobility rip into each other in their search for power. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the cost of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. All your support there is very gratefully received, but another way to support the podcast would be if you could spare a few minutes to post a review of the podcast in your app of choice. That would really help other people find the podcast. You can find details of all the ways to support the podcast at the website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp. you.